All right, so today I'm here to talk to you about calendar tricks, and this is something near and dear to my heart. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about calendar technology in general. We had old-timey calendars for the longest time, and you know what I'm talking about. It's the calendars you'd put it on your wall. I remember when I first started as a lawyer, everybody had one on their desk. They had a big blotter-style desk calendar that you put on top of your desk, and you'd have your court appearances on it staring back at you all day. And that was the calendar technology for all of calendar time. We really didn't have a lot of innovation, and you use calendars really to track your appointments. That's all they were really good for because it was a piece of paper with a limited amount of space, and there was just a lot of limitations to it. And it's great that it's looking straight back at you. I mean, I've got a paper calendar on my wall from the Focused podcast that I use for planning, but generally they're very limited in functionality. And then we got digital calendars. And I'm of the age where I remember where these things came into being. Calendars weren't really much of a thing with the original Mac, but the first time calendars as a digital alternative came to my mind was with the Palm Pilot. And the thing about the Palm Pilot was if you had your calendar in your Palm Pilot and then you dropped your Palm Pilot into the ocean, you didn't lose your calendar. You could go get another Palm Pilot and resync it and get your data back in your pocket. And that was the first time that it occurred to me that a digital calendar is a different beast from an analog calendar. But of course it is. And an analogy that comes to my mind is the introduction of motion pictures. When movies were first a thing, if you go back to the time that moving pictures first came onto the scene, the way directors and movie production people would shoot movies would be just as they would when they watched plays. Historically, for so much of human history, the way we consumed drama was we'd sit in an audience and we'd watch people on a stage do something. Well, with motion pictures, then we had the ability to capture that. And most of the original movies were shot from the vantage point of someone sitting in the audience. And it took years for them to realize, oh, wait a second, what if we put the camera at different angles? And what if we put the camera on the stage? Because now we can do that because we're no longer constrained by being in a theater with seats and a stage. And I feel like that's been the initial response to digital calendars, is even though we've got digital calendars that have a lot more power in them, we're still, a lot of us, in this weird phase where we're treating them the exact same way we treated those paper calendars we hung on the wall or stuck on our desk calendar. And by that, I mean, we're still writing appointments in them and not really taking advantage of all the other things they can do. It's still a digital version of this. And that's not good enough. My goal today is to convince you to turn your calendar into something more, because this digital calendar can do more. So one of the ways is calendars for events. We look at this and we see calendars as a list of appointments. And this is exactly what we had with the old paper calendar. And for a lot of people, that's all they're doing with their digital calendars. But digital calendars for events have more ability than that. I mean, the first is you can set repeating events. I mean, before you'd have to write down with your pen. Now, if you've got a staff meeting every Friday afternoon, you can put it in there and click the right boxes and it repeats for you. So you don't have to worry about that. You can have alarms. Your analog calendar didn't have the ability to tap you on the wrist or play a sound to let you know that you had an appointment coming up. And that's something that I rely on greatly. The original calendars, you couldn't share. You couldn't set an appointment and share it with your coworkers or your significant other or anyone else in your life. And they also, of course, didn't have computer automation, which we're now starting to see with things like shortcuts, where you can automatically change things. As an example, with my calendar, I can run a shortcut that will move my appointments back 30 minutes. And in the old days, that wasn't possible. You had to get your eraser out if you could. And of course, digital calendars give you the ability to back up your calendar data. When I first started practicing law, I feel like I'm making myself sound old, but I had a paper calendar that fit in my pocket where I'd write things down. But if you lost that, it was gone. You had no way to repeat that data. That was why the Palm Pilot made the alarm bells go off in my head. But this is the easy stuff. You guys know all this. I'm not bringing you to this presentation today to tell you about easy stuff like this, but just to point out, even the historical use of calendars, digital calendars are better because they've got all this other power they bring to the table. But the other thing about digital calendars that I think people still have trouble, kind of grokking is that they're free. You can make as many calendars as you want. If you've got Apple Calendar or BusyCal or whatever, you don't have to have work and home calendar. If you look at the calendars as they ship on your new Mac, they always want to tell you, well, you've got your personal and your work calendar, but you can go crazy with that stuff. You can make as many of these different calendars as you want. And the more you put in there, the more options it gives you in slicing and dicing how you can view that data. And that's something you couldn't do with a paper calendar. I mean, as an example, this is a list of my calendars, and I'm not kidding. I mean, I have a lot of calendars, but I'm going to show you later why that helps me, but the first thing is digital calendars are better at the historical task of being a calendar, putting events in, tracking events. But then the other thing is the idea of new options, because calendars are digital now. They can give you powers that they didn't have before. And I call that calendars for tasks, because a lot of people will tell you, well, my calendar is my task manager. That's where I keep my tasks. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think it really should be calendars are for focus. What are the areas of your life that you want to focus on? And this is something I stumbled into when I, about 7 years ago, I left my law firm and I went out to be a solo attorney. And part of the reason I did it was because I wanted to grow the MacSparky stuff and kind of really have more time for that as well. And I wanted to make field guides, and that's stuff that I really like doing. And I got about 6 months to a year into it, and I realized I wasn't really making many field guides. I never could seem to find time, but that was an area of a focus for me. And I realized that the only way I could do that was to start thinking about carving out time for it. And that's what you can do with focus, which really, deals with this area in between a historical calendar. You've got the calendar events, but then you've got all the space in between. And what happens here? How do you figure out what's going to happen? How do you bring intentionality to the game? And the answer to that really is block scheduling. Now, before you scream and run off into the wilderness, because a lot of people don't like block scheduling, let me just talk about it for a second. There is a thing that I call bad block scheduling, and that is the idea of micro scheduling your day. I have a bunch of posts at MacSparky called hyper scheduling. I wish I had just called them block scheduling, because hyper scheduling has the wrong connotation to it, but this is doing it wrong, where you figure out your day and you create appointments for every little thing you do during the day, and I literally have had people tell me that, I tried, block scheduling. I gave myself 15 minutes to go to the bathroom at 10 o'clock. And that actually happens. And that's nuts. That's not block scheduling. But there is good block scheduling, and block scheduling can help you with your priorities and your focus. All of us have task lists. I was just hearing before we started today, some folks are using different task management applications. But the fact is, your task list is full of tasks, and you're never going to finish them. I was just talking yesterday to a friend about this. It's like, when I die, there's going to be things undone on my task list. And that doesn't really bother me, because I look at it as kind of a list of things that I can do, things that I think are important enough that I'd like to do them someday, and I'm keeping track of them. But if you look at it this way, you're going to go nuts every day. But instead, if you have a good task list system, you can highlight certain tasks within that system that are important to you, getting back to what is your area of focus, whether it is, growing your clients, or, making your kids have the right values, or whatever it is that's important to you. There's probably pieces of your task list that can help you on that. And that is those areas of focus. And that is where block scheduling comes in. So you take the little pieces of that big infinite task list and you pull it out, and then you put them into your calendar. You find time to do for the important things. To get back to the story earlier, when I first left the law firm and I was frustrated about my inability to get work done, what I was doing instead was not making time for the field guides and the MacSparky stuff that was important to me. So I started block scheduling time in there to do that. And that made all the difference for me. The reason I'm such a believer in this stuff is because it works for me. And it wasn't taking my whole task list and dumping it into my calendar. It was taking little tiny pieces of it that related to the things most important to me and making sure I got them into the calendar. And then suddenly that became important and I started getting work done with them. This is just my calendar for the last week. And just to show you, I block schedule most days, and I do it on Sunday, and then that gives me the time for the next week. I just leave appointments until I get to the active week, and then I block time. You can see I've got time in here for field guides and for a lot of time this week on preparing for today's webinar. But, that is the important focus of my life. And the only way I'm able to get it done is if I make time for it and I block schedule. So I'm practicing what I preach. And I think this is something that can help everyone. But if you want to try it, there's a couple general rules. This stuff isn't rocket science, but there are some things to think about. The first is blocks are not equal to appointments. I think a lot of times we put these blocks on our schedule and we try to say, well, this is just like an appointment. Or even more common, I think, is the assumption that these are less important than my appointments. Like, well, I have to be at the dentist, but this block here is optional. I would argue the blocks are more important than your appointments, that they're not equal because they're superior to. I mean, if you're figuring out what's most important to you in your life, why are you not making time for it? And why aren't you treating that time as sacred? So the first step I would say is, if you're going to try this block scheduling, pick something of importance to you and make time for it and treat it as important as it should be because you've chosen this. The next thing is that longer is better. The 15-minute break to go to the bathroom is dumb. But if you're like, as a lawyer, if I was going to write a contract, a lot of times I would think, well, I could do that in an hour and it would end up taking me 2 hours. So you want to learn kind of to estimate how much time it takes. And when you're getting started, you should really assume that it's going to take a lot longer than it does, because as humans, we're terrible at this stuff. And if you don't estimate enough time, you don't have enough time to finish it within your block, and then you run into kind of a crash. So make them longer. If you're not sure, if you think it's going to take an hour, give it 3 hours. And then maybe if you finish in 2 hours, then you've got an hour to goof off or work on something else, but then at least you don't end up behind every day. And it gives you a much more reasonable amount of work to do in the day. The next is that even though they're sacred and even though they're important, they can move. These are not appointments with the dentist. So if you get in a jam, then you can move it. Like I recently had a big block of time to work on something, and I had something personal come up that I had to deal with. It wasn't the end of the world. I just took the block and I drug it to the next day on my digital calendar because it's digital, and I did it. And but I think a mistake people can make is, even though these are important, I want you to think that doesn't mean that they're carved in stone in that specific time period on your calendar. Figure out what works when you plan the week, but be willing to move things around, because when you put this rigidity to the appointments and the block schedule appointments, you start to feel like it's a burden. And this is not a burden. This is an enabling device to help you do your best work. Another thing is, blocks can serve different purposes. So far, I've been talking about them as a way to leverage your time to work on what's most important to you, your biggest focus. But you can also use them as what I call boxes, or probably more specifically, container boxes. So email is a problem for me. Everybody's got a problem with email, right? So here is a block that's on most days on my calendar. at 4 p.m. or 1600, I have an hour block, which I call comms and admin. And that's when I deal with whether admin stuff is on my plate, and I answer email and I go through Slack and my messages and all that stuff in that hour. Now, the reason that's on my calendar as a block is so it stays within an hour. If I didn't address it as a block, I would spend 3 hours on this stuff, because we all know that email is a thing that feeds on itself. Once you answer an email, they write back, then you write back, and it can go on forever. And this isn't the most important thing of my life. It's something that's important enough that I give it an hour a day, but no more. And I know everybody's different, and maybe you've got a sales job and you need to have 3 hours for email, but a lot of people don't. And one of the things I found was that the reason I wasn't getting the work done that I truly wanted to was I was going down these communication rabbit holes and getting stuck in them all day. So I used block scheduling as a way to contain it. So this is a container box for time. So this is something I recommend you try. And if an hour isn't long enough, make it an hour and a half. I generally get about an hour is really not quite enough time for me to deal with it all. I like that. I don't want it to expand beyond that, but it is certainly enough time for me to deal with the most important stuff. So blocks can be boxes. Another thing blocks can be is they can be a place to enable habits. One of the things I do is I do this shutdown every day. At the end of the day, I plan the next day and I do some work on that. We just covered this in the MacSparky Labs. And I've been trying to be more healthy. And in Southern Cal, as it starts to get warm, the sun stays up late. Every night I take a 2-mile hike, every night that I can. And so I put it on my calendar as a block. And then that way it's something that I actually do. If I didn't put it in the calendar, it's probably not going to happen. So I'm using blocks here to try and I'm using blocks to try and set up some very specific habits for myself. Another thing with blocks is you need to make them count. I think another mistake people make is they start putting these blocks in, but they ignore them. And, because they've got so much going on in their lives, they're like, well, that was a great idea, but it doesn't really matter that much. And that gets me back to the beginning. These blocks should be the most important appointments you do, because when you get to the end of the week or the end of the day, if you actually spend time on the things that are most important to you, you're going to feel a lot more satisfied. There's just no question about it. And this is all stuff available to us because we have digital calendars. I mean, in the old days when I had the calendar on the desk, this was not an option, but now it is. And I really believe this block scheduling can help. Another piece of this for me, and this is something that has really been on my mind recently, is planning. We all are trying to figure out how we're going to get the work done we want, and think more long-term. And planning is difficult when you start filling up your calendar. I went ahead and blurred this because I've got a couple doctor appointments and things on it, but this is a blurry version of my month calendar. And you can get the idea looking at it that I've got a lot of appointments. I mean, some of these are blocks appointments. Some of them are doctor appointments. Some of them are work on the MacSparky Labs and all this stuff. But when I'm trying to do planning, this is really useless to me. Fantastical now has this great quarterly view, and it's the same problem. I beg them to put a quarterly view in, but when I put my calendar data up, it's just garbage because I've got so much calendar data in there. So the fact that I was using the calendar so well meant that the planning functions of the calendar kind of became unusable for me. So I got to thinking, well, how would I solve that? And this is a bit of insight I had, is that here's a clear quarterly view calendar. What if I just wanted the planning events to show up? But how can you really figure that out? I mean, a planning event is just another event on a calendar. If I have a MacSparky calendar and I want to plan to record a video or plan for this webinar, that is just another calendar event. And it's going to have a time associated with it. And I'm going to have all this garbage on my screen before I know what I'm doing. But then I got back thinking to the idea, that calendars are free, right? So I made a bunch of additional calendars for the purpose of planning. And if you look at this here, just zooming in, here's a bunch of them. I've got a planning calendar for working on MacSparky stuff. I write a newsletter that has a planning calendar. These webinars have a planning calendar. Every element of the things I produce has its own planning calendar. And what I did with this is I made a separate calendar for each one. And because they're separate calendars, I can choose to show them or hide them. And I create events with a planning calendar that I can show up on my big calendar, and it just shows me how things are going without looking at the specifically hour, and minute appointments. So some tips for this. First is a planning calendar event is an all-day event for me. It's an event that is all day, so it shows above the line in my digital calendar. It's also created often via automation. If I'm going to create, for instance, today's webinar, I'm going to add it to my calendar. Shortcuts will create a separate appointment that says the webinar is today. It'll be an all-day event and put it in the webinar planning calendar. Calendar sets really help. We talked before we started the session today about different applications, but if you have an application where you can say, put together a set of calendars for me that just show all the planning calendars, then you can show that to the exclusion of everything else. Now, you can do this in a traditional calendar app like Apple's Calendar app, but in that case, you've got to go through and manually check the boxes every time you want to change the view. Calendar sets, you just push one button and everything shows up. And here is my planning calendar for the month. So in contrast to that blurry one I showed you earlier, you can see these are all-day events. And I've got releases of blog posts, I've got newsletters, I've got webinars and content for the MacSparky Labs. I've even got personal stuff on a personal planning calendar. And these are all-day events. So I can just look at this very quickly and see what is on deck for me during a certain period of time. And using Fantasticao's new quarterly view, I can see that out in 3 months. And I find this an extremely useful planning tool. And again, this is a way of filtering my calendar through the use of multiple calendars and all-day events and calendar plans. And so now my calendar transforms itself into a planning device. Again, this is something you couldn't do with an analog calendar. So it's very useful, I find, to do a planning calendar, and I'll answer questions about that in a bit. Another thing I do with a calendar is I can turn it into a diary. And this is real simple, but I have a plan for each day. This was yesterday's plan. And as the day goes on, I actually update the calendar events to show what I actually did. So here is the plan, and then here's the day for yesterday. And you can see, like, I didn't finish. I was going to do work on the next Mac Power Users outline, but I wanted to get the webinar outline done, and that took longer than I thought it would. So I ended up spending time in the afternoon and in the evening working on this, and I updated my calendar. And the feedback loop from that is great, because now I know that in the future, I'm probably underestimating how long it's going to take to get the work done for these webinars. And the next time I do one, I'll probably calendar more time ahead of time. I'll block more time so I have a better handle on that. And ideally, as you go through this and you kind of diary the days at the end of the day, you do get better at figuring out where the areas in your life are that take more time than you think, or less time. And that gives you a bit of feedback. So maybe you want to plan it better, or get some help, or just figure out a better way to handle it. And again, it gives me a nice feedback tool. So that's another way I use these digital calendars. Now, we talked before the session started today about apps. Just briefly, a short note on this. I mean, there's a lot of apps out there, and people all are pretty passionate about the apps they use, and I think that's great. I use Fantastical. I'm not really here to sell you Fantastical. They don't even know I'm doing the webinar or talking about them. But the reason I am a paying subscriber is it gives me a few extra benefits that I think are really worth it. The first is calendar sets, which I talked about earlier. The ability to set those calendar sets together gives me the ability to jump between the planning calendar and the MacSparky calendar, or the personal calendar, or in a few months ago, it was the legal calendar. I can very quickly get different views of my calendar data. And this is the setup screen they have for that. You can see I have a lot of different calendar sets, and this allows me to really slice and dice my calendar at will. Another thing they've got is the quarterly view, which I think is really useful for planning. I mean, the quarterly view is something I find myself using all the time. I actually was one of the people, I'm sure there are others, I don't want to take all the credit, but I begged for this feature because I felt like calendars always had a day, a week, a month, and a year view, but quarter is very useful for people, and I really like that they added that feature. Another thing they have is really easy event sharing. Like if I want to set an appointment, I can send a list of available times to someone, and they can select among those, and then it gets automatically on my calendar. And I didn't even really get into that today, but digital calendars give you the ability to have people either set appointments with you or you control the way they set appointments with you, which is another advantage over analog calendars. The menu bar, it sounds dumb, but I like having that little thing in my menu bar that tells me my upcoming appointments, and this application does that. And just a lot of usability improvements. They've got the parser where you can type in and add events very quickly. And it's just an application that is developed a lot faster than Apple's calendar app. So I wanted something, because I do use calendars so extensively. But your calendars can be more than this. And that's really the point of all this. I've shown you a couple tricks today: block scheduling, planning calendars, diaries, and just event planning. I think all of this stuff is such a benefit. And I think so many of us are still in the audience with our movie cameras looking at the stage, that when it comes to calendars, we've got to start thinking about them as a digital device. This is a transformation. It's never happened before. Our parents didn't have this. All the generations before didn't have these options, but now we do. So the question is, what are you going to do with that power? How are you going to turn a calendar into more than just a place that you go to figure out when you're going to the dentist? So that's my pitch to you. I hope I've given you some ideas today. I am David Sparks. I'm at macsparky.com. If you're coming to this and you don't know who I am, my goal is to merge Apple technology and productivity. I want to help people be more productive with their Apple gear. I've got a website called macsparky.com. I've got a bunch of field guides, which are very extensive kind of tutorials, video tutorials on how to do stuff with your Apple technology. I make some podcasts that I'm really proud of. You can find all of them at Relay FM. And I've got the MacSparky Labs, which is the newest thing, where I go into even greater detail about how all this stuff works with my supporters. And you can find that at macsparky.com as well. Either way, I'd love to have you come check out some of my content if you haven't. Thanks for paying attention to all this. Hopefully you're still with me. And now it's time for me to answer questions about your calendars. So it looks like I wasn't able to see. Are field guides books or online videos? They are online videos, Keith. Historically, I wrote books. I wrote books that went into the bookstore, and then I wrote ebooks for Apple. Now I'm actually just doing these as video courses. You learn this stuff a lot better via video, in my opinion. So I'll go ahead and turn off the screen share here. And let's start answering some questions. Patrick says, confirming my workflows and adding a few useful tips. That's awesome. I'm going to go over to the question and answer list. And I'm just going to go from the top down. Greg, how is the best way to keep track of the MacSparky calendar in Fantastical? Are you talking about the Labs calendar? If it's that, you can just subscribe to it, and that should get you. If you have a problem and you're a Lab subscriber, Greg, give me an email that, and I'll answer your question in more detail. Fred, I didn't understand how the diary worked. Is that a different calendar in the calendar set? It could be. I tested that out at one point to say, like, I had a calendar called the Plan, and I would put all the calendar events as a plan, and then I would have a separate calendar and say, the day, and I would put the events in as the day, and then I could put them next to each other at the end of the day to see how they stacked up against each other. But that I found too tedious, and I didn't really need the data stored that way. So what I do instead is I have them in the individual calendars, like I explained during the webinar. I have a little Apple script that I run. I'm sorry, a little shortcut that I run at the beginning of the day. It gives me a list of the events, and I put it in my diary of how the day is planned. And at the end of the day, I adjust it to match. And I don't use any automation there. I just literally take my mouse and I drag the appointments and change them, as you would historically do manually inside the calendar app. So I don't really need to I don't really need to have a separate calendar for it, but you could do it that way. I think it might be a little tedious. From Felipe, on the plan versus the day calendar, do you keep these two in separate calendars? Same question. Yeah, I don't. I just go ahead, like I said, and I just adjust it at the end of the day. from Chris, what's the backend syncing service for all those calendars? I use iCloud. It's been worked for me fine for a long time. With the MacSparky Labs, I now have public calendars there, and I found that sharing that with hundreds of people was not reliable. So I do the public sharing via Fastmail, which is my mail service. They also have a calendar service, and that seems to be working pretty well. But I generally use iCloud for everything that I track. From Claude, I'd love to know about your shutdown ritual. Okay, at some point I'll talk about that, but that's a topic for another day. Going back to the top, some more have been coming in here. Is there a good way to integrate OmniFocus projects with Fantastical? You can drag an OmniFocus task into any calendar, including Fantastical, and it will create an event with that task name, and it will have a link that you can click and jump right back to the OmniFocus. It's got the linking in between. I call it contextual computing or focused computing, and it makes it very easy to jump between OmniFocus and your calendar. That said, I rarely do that. I will use OmniFocus to surface those specific tasks I want to work on, but then I just create an event in the calendar, say work on that thing. I may put a link back to the project, but I don't usually have links back to individual tasks. Craig, you mentioned automation on your calendars. What automation shortcuts have you found most useful? The ones I find most useful for calendars is the ones to create events. Like if I have a routine project, like make a podcast. When we get a new guest on the Mac Power Users, I run a shortcut that will prepare an email to that person and create a list in OmniFocus, and it'll create a calendar event for the recording time of the event, but it will create a separate event on the planning calendar that will show up that we're recording the show on that day. So when I see the planning calendar, I can just say, oh yeah, we're recording a show that day, but I don't have to get into the nitty gritty details. So I find automation stuff like that really useful. Also, because I block schedules, sometimes when things go long, if I don't estimate well and I run out of time, I have some shortcuts I've written that help me automatically move times of things later in the day. And I find that one also very useful. But I'm really into automation. I'm not trying to sell you stuff, but the shortcuts field guide goes into a lot of calendar automation stuff like that. Jordy, I love to hear your thoughts on sharing calendars with family members. I share one with my wife so I can see her appointments, but she also uses it as her to-do list. So it adds additional clutter in my calendar. That is always the problem with the family calendar. Apple gives you this access to a family calendar and people put like their personal stuff in it. So what I try to do is I try to share my personal items with family members that they're going to be participating in, and try not to use a generic family calendar as much as possible. If my wife like shares an event with me, then it shows up on mine. But she does share a calendar with me that is just hers, but I usually have it turned off. So if I want to see when she's working, I can click it on to see when she works. And if they do kind of like start sharing stuff into your general calendars, just talk to them about it. Don't be a jerk about it. But you know how it goes. Question from Zach. Journaling is also valuable for fun stuff in life, travel, meals, movies, etc. Adding details to a calendar entry can help. Excellent point, Zach. I do that as well. The question from Keith. Are you only digital calendar, not analog paper? Do you just suggest whatever works best for each person, but use the same techniques? So I am primarily digital, but if you listen to my Focused podcast every year, we do this thing where we sell a wall-size calendar that I actually have up on my wall right now. I can see it. And I put the big things on that, and they're usually multi-day events. So I like to put that on there because when I'm on the phone and somebody asks me to do something, I look at my calendar and say, wow, I'm really busy then. So it gives me a way to say no. So having one as like a physical presence is not a bad idea, but all the fiddly stuff I do with planning and details and stuff all happens on the digital calendar. Question from Joe. I love having many calendars, especially when sharing a focused calendar with a partner. However, none of the calendar apps do the obvious thing and create blocking events in the other calendars. After years of trying to do this manually, I gave up and just have 2 calendars now. I'm not sure, Joe, what that means. So you can make calendar blocks and share. Joe, send me an email. And once I understand that better, I can answer your question better. Question from Helga. Do you have any tool to add up the hours and minutes that belong to a specific project? Yeah, that's time tracking for me, and I do that with a combination of Timery and the Timing app. And if you're curious about that, Helga, you are going to love the episode of Mac Power Users that drops this Sunday. Brandon, is there a way to integrate Omni? Oh, I already answered that question. Sorry. Will there be a recording available? Yes, there will be. If you sign up for these webinars, a recording gets sent to you. Unfortunately, the way Webinar Jam does it, they start recording the moment I flip the button. So the 5 or 10 minutes I'm waiting for people to show up also gets on that recording. But because this one doesn't really fit into any existing field guide, I'm going to go ahead and just put it on YouTube with an edited version. So there'll be a couple different ways that you can do that. How can I drag emails into iCal? Belong to boards that send emails that contain a button for getting into a meeting. So a couple ways. I believe with the Apple Calendar app, in the metadata of a calendar event, you can just drag an email into it and it'll save a link back to that email. If you go on the MacSparky site and search email URL, I forget the exact phrase you want to use, but I have created an Apple script that copies a link to any email out of Apple Mail, and you can paste that. So there's a couple ways you can get through that. Question from Manny. How do you define the role of an all-day event in relation to block scheduling? So if you're talking about the planning stuff I was doing, it's just there for me to see in the planning view. I don't see it there. But if there's an all-day event that involves me being somewhere, it a lot of times will impact how much block scheduling I can do. I'm not sure I really understand that question, Manny. If you could clarify it or send me an email, I'll be happy to answer that. Question from Tom. Why are planning calendars all-day events? I make them all-day events because the way I display them is like I showed in the presentation, that filtered view that just shows the planning events. I don't want to see times. I just want to know what's going on that day. I don't need to know what time it starts at. And that gives me kind of a good overview for planning. Now, I have a different calendar set that lets me see the specific times of things that have times related to them. But a lot of times these planning events don't have times related to them. Right now, I'm working on an update to the Keyboard Maestro field guide, and that's not really an event so much as an overriding thing that's going on in my life for the next couple of weeks, if that makes any sense. Question from Artist says, Artist has a question below. And sorry, I'm doing my best to kind of keep up with these. They're coming in pretty fast. If you add links from registering for a webinar, how do you choose which calendar it goes to with Google? Usually with Google, you can pick the calendar at the time you add it, but that's usually a checkbox. I don't use Google a lot, but the times I've used it, that hasn't been an issue. Esteban, I use OmniFocus and Calendar extensively together. I plan the following day's tasks in OmniFocus using flags, defer dates, and estimated duration. And with a shortcut, I send all of them to the calendar. That's a good way to do it via automation. So what he's doing is filtering down that big task list we started about and then using automation to create calendar events. That if that works, then that's a good way to do it. And Scott says, what I think is funny is that you get a reminder from MacSparky and you can add it to Google or Outlook, but no Apple. Okay. Webinar Jam does not have a native Apple Calendar integration. I've written them about that. I know the irony of that, and I'm working on it, but it's a big company, and I've got to convince them. And I've already paid the yearly subscription for Webinar Jam, and it was a lot of money, so I'm just going to have to keep using it until I figure out if they update it or I go to some other service. But yeah, trust me, I am well aware of that. But either way, okay, one last question. Christopher, do you happen to know if there's any way to grab a link to an event in Fantastical? Yeah, I believe there is. But let me look into that. I don't really want to open my calendar right now, but yeah, you should be able to create a link. If you drag a Fantastical event like into the Apple Notes app, it creates a link, and anywhere that can accept a link on your Mac, it does. To create a hard link without dragging it, I need to look into that. But either way, well, that's what I wanted to talk about today, though, with calendars, is a way to get this stuff to work better. I do think that there's a mind shift required because calendars are way more powerful than they used to be. And if you only think about a calendar as a way to track when you need to go to the dentist, you're missing out. And I have personally found this stuff to be really useful to help me get what I think is important in my life in progress. And I hope you do too. So, like I said, I'm Max Sparky. You can find me over down to the over at maxsparky.com. If you have questions on this stuff, send them through to me. I only answer email for an hour, but I'll do my best to get to yours. And I hope you guys enjoyed the session today. Any final thoughts or questions before I hang up for the day? Brandon says, I'm glad you're doing all this with Brute Force and Obsidian. Yes, I like Obsidian, but I also like other apps that are really made to do the job. Like a calendar app is an excellent calendar. Obsidian isn't as great of a calendar app as you would think. And a lot of thank yous. Thank you, everybody. It's really my pleasure to share this stuff with you. I meant what I said with that little screen with the intersection of those circles. I want anybody who gives me the privilege of their time to get something out of this and be able to get further with their goals and dreams. And hopefully this will help you along. Either way, thanks for your time today. If you're watching the recording, thanks for watching the recording. Head over to maxsparky.com if you'd like to learn any more. And everybody have a great day.